The natal square between Venus and Saturn represents one of the most structurally grueling, psychologically exhausting, and somatically armored configurations a human relational blueprint can carry. In the archetypal architecture of astrology, Venus is the principle of effortless attraction, relational symmetry, aesthetic pleasure, value, and the capacity to open the self to the warm, receptive currents of intimacy and social cohesion. Saturn, by absolute contrast, is the grim reaper of the zodiac, the cosmic architect of limitation, chronological time, severe boundary definition, systemic scarcity, judgment, and the inescapable law of gravity and duty. When these two conflicting forces lock into a high-friction, 90-degree square, the individual's capacity to give and receive love is subjected to a permanent state of psychological siege. The native does not experience affection as an innate birthright or a light, fluid exchange. Instead, they experience the realm of romance, beauty, and self-worth through the lens of a profound, cold deficit. It is the archetype of the romantic ascetic, the fortress built around an empty hearth, and the grueling lifelong mandate to transform a chronic, self-sabotaging expectation of rejection into an unshakable column of sovereign self-respect and realistic, battle-tested intimacy. To comprehend the rigid internal mechanics of the Venus-square-Saturn aspect is to examine a relational apparatus that operates with a hyper-vigilant, defensive radar calibrated entirely for abandonment. For the native, the subjective experience of desire is characterized by an absolute, low-grade state of unworthiness. The Venus-Saturn individual carries a profound subconscious script that equates vulnerability with immediate humiliation, emotional starvation, or absolute structural collapse. They operate under the unconscious conviction that love is never free, that if they show their raw, unguarded nakedness, or if they allow themselves to genuinely depend on the warmth of another person, they will inevitably be judged as inadequate, found wanting, and brutally cast out into the cold. Consequently, the conscious ego attempts to manage this ambient terror of rejection by erecting massive, impenetrable psychological ramparts, preemptively armor-plating the emotional core and treating every genuine offer of affection not as a sanctuary, but as an audit or an impending trap. This permanent internal mobilization breeds a highly problematic behavioral loop known as the trauma loop of romantic starvation and hyperdefensive isolation. In their interpersonal relationships, Venus-square-Saturn individuals are intensely prone to developing a severe push-pull dynamic characterized by an absolute intolerance for emotional fluidity. Because they do not believe they can be loved for simply existing, they instinctively seek out connections defined by heavy labor, massive structural friction, or geographic and emotional unavailability. They are repeatedly drawn to partners who are emotionally frozen, hypercritical, or trapped in circumstances that prevent true intimacy, because this external coldness perfectly matches their internal baseline of scarcity. To relieve the agonizing internal pressure of potential rejection, the native will often deploy calculated acts of defensive withdrawal, manifesting as total emotional stiffness, severe emotional withholding, or sudden, freezing boundary testing designed to force the partner to prove their loyalty through grueling labor. They intentionally choke the warmth out of a connection to see if it can survive the frost, fully convinced that they are only safe when a relationship feels like a joyless, duty-bound obligation. The roots of this profound psychological dislocation are invariably traced back to an early childhood environment defined by intense emotional austerity, conditional approval, or a severe, premature shattering of the child's sense of aesthetic and relational worth. The child hosting this square was typically raised in an atmospheric field where love was treated as a transactional commodity, strictly contingent upon performance, perfection, obedience, or structural utility. A primary caregiver, frequently an authoritarian maternal or paternal figure, was experienced as a cold, critical, or emotionally inaccessible judge whose approval was endlessly pursued but rarely granted. Alternatively, the childhood home may have been choked by systemic poverty, heavy domestic burdens, or an ambient atmosphere of grim survival that forced the child to suppress their needs for play, beauty, and soft affection in order to become a functional asset to the family unit. The child internalized a devastating, foundational lesson: your desire is an inconvenience, your vulnerability is a weakness, and to survive, you must become a machine of self-reliance, hiding your tender heart behind a wall of absolute self-containment. Energetically and physically, hosting this grinding, crystalline friction places an immense, exhausting strain on the individual's physical vehicle. Venus rules the kidneys, the throat, the reproductive tracts, the skin, and the venous circulation, while Saturn rules the bones, the teeth, joints, calcification, and the structural limits of the body. When these two forces collide in a tense square, the physical body becomes a literal materialization of the mind's rigid relational armor. These individuals live with an extreme degree of somatic compression, unconsciously holding massive amounts of defensive survival tension in their jaw, their neck, their pelvic floor, and their spine. This constant state of physiological emergency manifests over time as chronic structural alignment issues, severe throat and vocal cord constrictions, renal system stagnation, premature aging of the skin, or chronic reproductive and endocrine blockages that arise whenever they feel relationally disempowered or unloved. The physical tissue accurately mirrors the mind's internal baseline of scarcity through chronic tightness and calcification, as the body literally ossifies itself to withstand the cold winds of perceived abandonment. Yet, the ultimate evolutionary architecture of the Venus-square-Saturn aspect is not designed to permanently traumatize, freeze, or condemn the native to a lifetime of lonely isolation. It is the elite training ground for the supreme master of authentic, grounded relationship. The universe deliberately starves these individuals of easy, superficial validation and effortless romantic fairy tales so that they are forced to dismantle their codependent reliance on external praise and discover an unshakable, self-generated emotional sovereignty. The cosmos subjects them to endless romantic delays, devastating rejections, and exhausting relational trials not to destroy them, but to burn away every single drop of their infantile emotional entitlement, shallow vanity, and desperate need for outside mirrors to prove their worth. They are being systematically re-engineered into the ultimate pillars of relational maturity and real-world commitment, individuals who can build lasting, monumental partnerships based on reality, honor, and structural integrity because they no longer require a partner to act as an emotional anesthesia for their underlying fears. The supreme liberation for this placement requires a radical, terrifying act of somatic and psychological surrender. The native must learn the supreme courage of staying in the room and allowing their rigid armor to melt in the presence of genuine warmth. The agonizing, repeating cycle of attraction, paralyzing fear of rejection, and self-inflicted emotional starvation will never cease until the individual undergoes a profound shift in consciousness, realizing that the critical, withholding monster they are constantly fighting or running from in their relationships is actually the projection of their own repressed Saturnian judgment attempting to break them out of the suffocating tomb of their own defense mechanisms. They must learn to tolerate the immense vulnerability of being soft and awkward, allowing themselves to feel the terrifying weight of another person's unconditional care without interpreting that warmth as a debt they cannot repay. They must undergo a total death of the hyper-independent, stoic ego, willingly letting their defensive battlements drop, embracing the raw, trembling grief of their childhood emotional neglect, and learning to anchor their deep capacity for love within a core of profound somatic presence and realistic self-worth. When a Venus-square-Saturn native finally alchemizes this aspect, shifting from a defensive, self-sabotaging fortress of isolation into a sovereign master of concentrated relational force, a magnificent transfiguration occurs. The heavy, armor-plated ego shell dissolves, leaving behind an unbreakable, magnetic pillar of pure worldly, creative, and psychological authority. Having sat in the absolute coldest, darkest chambers of romantic isolation, stared directly into the absolute bottom of the psychological abyss of unworthiness, and survived the total annihilation of their infantile needs for cheap validation, they possess an unmatched, terrifying stamina. They emerge into the world entirely immune to the emotional manipulations, shallow seductions, and superficial value systems of the collective. They become the ultimate crisis anchors, master relationship architects, and defenders of enduring bonds, individuals who can walk completely unafraid into the most chaotic, broken, and toxic relational environments on Earth, hold the entire weight of human shadow and structural reality on their shoulders with an unblinking, majestic composure, and manifest monumental healing and rock-solid devotion because their capacity to love was forged in the absolute zero of self-mastery. To descend beneath the outermost armored defenses of the Venus-square-Saturn alignment is to expose a psychological matrix operating like a medieval stone fortress, architecturally flawless, built to withstand a century-long siege, yet chillingly cold and empty at its hearth. While the external presentation of this native often commands profound respect for its impeccable dignity, its legendary financial and relational discipline, and its unyielding, rock-solid reliability, a clinical exploration of its core reveals a darker, more exhausting operational reality. The psyche runs a permanent, non-negotiable background script that decodes immediate affection, effortless praise, and casual romantic optimism as an absolute insult to intelligence. Venus is the relational organism that longs to drop its posture, yield its defenses, and surrender to the soft, symmetrical pleasure of unconditional desirability. Saturn is the absolute, unyielding law of gravity, scarcity, and chronological trial that demands structural justification and severe border control. The square locks these two principles into a high-friction, 90-degree structural collision, forcing the native to spend decades living with a nervous system that registers a partner's spontaneous warmth or an easy, friction-free courtship not as a sanctuary, but as a cruel, deceptive anesthesia designed to trick them into lowering their guard before the inevitable axe of rejection falls. The most profound, insidious pathology of this configuration is a phenomenon that can be defined as the hyperfixation on the ledger of debt. Because the native's deep cellular memory is hardwired with the baseline conviction that love is never a birthright and approval must be exhaustively paid for through utility and perfection, they develop an absolute intolerance for authentic relational softness. A Venus-square-Saturn individual cannot simply rest in a peaceful relationship, accept a genuine compliment, or surrender to the fluid, playful rhythm of a quiet life. Their mind functions as a permanent internal audit chamber, obsessively calculating the invisible cost, underlying obligations, and eventual deficit of every affectionate exchange. If a relationship is genuinely easy and devoid of friction, the native experiences an acute, terrifying disorientation. The very smoothness of the connection feels like a trap designed to leave them relationally bankrupt when the bill comes due. To relieve this internal panic, they will instinctively deploy calculated acts of emotional refrigeration, manifesting as stiff behavioral boundaries, hypercritical testing, or long periods of stoic withholding, designed to force the partner to prove their love through grueling, joyless labor. They intentionally choke the warmth out of a connection to see if it can survive the frost, fully convinced that a bond is only safe when it feels like an exhausting, duty-bound obligation. This permanent internal mobilization breeds a highly problematic behavioral mechanism known as the psychic preemptive eviction through emotional austerity. Because these individuals carry a foundational blueprint of absolute vulnerability resulting in humiliation or emotional starvation, they live in a state of chronic defensive mobilization. If they sense that a partner is getting too close, or if they perceive that they are beginning to genuinely depend on the warmth of another person, the Venus-Saturn current instantly shifts their nervous system from an attachment footing to a completely fortified, unyielding posture. Rather than communicating their tender underlying fear of inadequacy or their profound sense of romantic loneliness, which their fierce, stoic ego structure views as an act of absolute, humiliating regression, they launch devastatingly cold, sudden, and completely disproportionate campaigns of emotional desertion. They will freeze out a partner for days over a minor perceived slight, look at a weeping lover with absolute, mask-like detachment, or reduce a passionate romance to a series of dry, administrative agreements. This tactical ruthlessness routinely creates the exact catastrophe they dread. They inadvertently traumatize their loved ones, starve their allies of basic human reciprocity, and turn their interpersonal world into the exact dead, frozen desert they spend their life running from. Furthermore, this aspect creates an exceptionally dangerous, almost addictive relationship with the archetype of the emotional labor camp. The Venus-Saturn native possesses an absolute, deep-seated contempt for anything that feels soft, easily accessible, or inherently light in the relational realm. They suffer from an ambient guilt whenever life is simple and grounded, viewing emotional satisfaction as a dangerous sedative that dulls their executive edge. To cure this anxiety, they are repeatedly drawn to highly unviable, hypercritical, or pathologically damaged partners, individuals who are deeply depressed, who are trapped in other marriages, or who possess a punishing, withholding nature that perfectly matches their own internal baseline of scarcity. They seek out connections that embody the sharp, unyielding weight of Saturn, bonds that require immense work, forces that will demand they suppress their own needs to keep the structure standing. To the twisted, survivalist calculus of this configuration, enduring the elegant torment of an unfulfilled romance, surviving the hollow ache of a critical partnership, and living in the pristine isolation of a perpetual long-distance or duty-based dynamic is the only authentic state of connection, leading them to view a peaceful, stable, and healthy partnership not as a sanctuary, but as a suffocating, unearned pasture. On a genetic and karmic level, this square indicates that the individual has been appointed as the absolute executioner of a bloodline's unvetted relational grief, financial bankruptcy, and ancestral misalliances. They inherit a cellular matrix choked by generations of ancestors who survived through the severe, toxic suppression of their vulnerability, who were forced into loveless, transactional arranged marriages for socio-economic survival, or who lost vast fortunes overnight and associated desire with immediate catastrophe. The native does not just carry personal stress, they carry the compacted, radioactive trauma weight of 100 dead ascetics, unfulfilled lovers, and bankrupt lineages who lived with their passions and self-worth buried under the suffocating weight of societal obligation. Their psychic atmosphere feels heavy and serious because they are the designated circuit breaker who must choose either to consciously face, contain, and melt this rigid ancestral ice, or let it repeat its destructive cycle by physically and neurotically starving their own children, partners, and lives. The ultimate evolutionary liberation for the Venus-square-Saturn native requires a radical, terrifying act of somatic capitulation. They must learn the supreme courage of allowing their emotional defense mechanisms to be entirely dismantled without running away into the fortress of isolation. The agonizing, repeating cycle of attraction, paralyzing fear of rejection, and self-inflicted emotional starvation will never cease until the individual realizes that the critical, withholding monster they are fighting so viciously in the outside world is actually the projection of their own unintegrated Saturnian judgment attempting to break them out of the suffocating tomb of their own hyper-independent armor. They must undergo a total psychological death, willingly dropping their sharp, defensive tracking tactics, sitting completely exposed in the raw, awkward wreckage of their broken attachments, and discovering that when everything they thought kept them safe is stripped away, their core capacity to feel, love, and radically relate to the earth remains completely untouchable. When a Venus-square-Saturn native finally alchemizes this aspect, shifting from a defensive, self-sabotaging fortress of isolation into a sovereign master of concentrated relational force, a magnificent transfiguration occurs. The heavy, armor-plated ego shell dissolves, leaving behind an unbreakable, magnetic pillar of pure worldly, creative, and psychological authority. Having sat in the absolute coldest, darkest chambers of romantic isolation, stared directly into the absolute bottom of the psychological abyss of unworthiness, and survived the total annihilation of their infantile needs for external validation, they possess an unmatched, terrifying stamina. They emerge into the world entirely immune to the emotional manipulations, shallow seductions, and superficial value systems of the collective. They become the ultimate crisis anchors, master relationship architects, and defenders of enduring bonds, individuals who can walk completely unafraid into the most chaotic, broken, and toxic relational environments on Earth, hold the entire weight of human shadow and structural reality on their shoulders with an unblinking, majestic composure, and manifest monumental healing and rock-solid devotion because their capacity to love was forged in the absolute zero of self-mastery. Subscribe, like, and share.